Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome back to the Age of Warfare podcast. I am Sertorian Actions Maximus, who is fighting a cold. That is the gate, Aiden Cordier. And we're going to be talking about the Vikings, which I think is going to be a really fun subject to talk about. And it's just going to be and I'm sure Aiden, not about the Vikings, and yep. And before we get started, of course, Aiden, how are we doing today? As always,
it's doing okay. It's the weather turned last week and it suddenly got colder as well. As you can see, with the clocks changing as well, it's a bit darker in the evenings. But apart from that, it's doing pretty well. I had this week off actually. I wasn't expecting it, but I built up excess holiday, and the boss was like, "Have a week off." Okay. So I've just been going around the house fixing things, painting things, putting stuff away, tidying up. I've had a pretty successful week so far, actually. How about you?
Me, I was working on my new novel, started to work on it, making good progress until I got sick, until I caught a really bad head cold. And I just been feeling terrible, dusty. And yesterday, today I feel better. I'm doing the show today, so I'm feeling not better. But as you can hear in my voice, I'm not all that. So you might have to carry the show a little bit, Aiden. But I'm sure you're a wealth of information about the Vikings. So
I don't
think
get me started. You save your voice.
Yeah, but anyway, before we get started, a bit of a tangent here. My first foray with the Vikings was Age of Empires 2, where you could play as the Vikings. Yeah, and there's a unique unit called the Berserker. It looks like an actual Viking, and what I like about it is that if you leave it alone for a few seconds after it gets damaged, it recovers HP on its own. It regenerates HP. So, Dungeon Dan, welcome to the show, buddy. And we're talking about the Vikings. We asked Dungeon Dan, so thank you for joining us, Mr. Ubel. Yeah, we're talking about the Vikings today, so should be a fun subject. I actually want to start with something a little maybe people might not know as well. The Vikings had a presence in the Byzantine Empire.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yes,
very much so.
Yeah, Dungeon Dan says excellent. All right, so he's on board. You heard that the Vanguard guards.
The Varangian Guard.
Yeah. Varangian guards, excuse me. Yeah. Varangian guards. Yeah, they actually came from the Vikings. And some of them were natives of what is now modern day Russia.
Yes, this is a good place to start because we can connect it to obviously the TV show Vikings and Vikings Valhalla. I recommend people go and watch them. There are obviously there's some tweaks to obviously make it a TV show, but there's a lot of really good history in there at the same time. Vikings Valhalla, especially, there are so many of those people in there that were real people, and that's one of the things the show does. It takes real people and shows you through. But they have this bit with the Varangian Guard where you get this huge connection with Russia as well, because Russia isn't how we think of Russia is now. It was several completely different entities. We've talked about this before as well, haven't we?
You heard the Kievan Rus.
The Kievan Rus
Rus, yes.
Yeah, so obviously the name of Russia comes from the Rus,
and then Moscovy
as well. Yeah, so you get
Novgorod.
You got Novgorod, you got Muscovy, and you got the Kievan Rus, because what's now Moscow, now Kiev, and Novgorod, where they were the three major centers. Think of it like in Western Europe, in major centers of London to a certain extent, various periods. It was actually very small comparatively for a long time. But then you had Paris being a very big thing. That also comes up in Vikings in the later series about the Viking attacks on Paris, which is something we'll get to later because it sets up this later part of history. But then you get, if you go off into the Netherlands, we were talking to a friend the other day about some of the famous places there that were just before this era. that aren't places where you'd think of now. It's like, if you know history, you know where those places are. But there's not even me naming those places because you might know it with geography, but they're places that have all of this history. But because that world's changed so much, the those places, it's moved away from a lot of those places. You had these big centres, so obviously Rome's still a big centre at that point as well. But is it, all of the, if you think about feudalism, actually, it actually gets you in the right mind frame of that you have this centre place where the people are, and then the people around them, or even city states, it's the same thing. The people around them are connected or not connected. How they're connected to them is up in the air. It's not like, say, in the modern US, where you live in a state and you live on a border and you move to a town 40 miles north and then suddenly you're in another state. It didn't work like that. That could still be the same person's lands, or it could be that it was completely different lands where you'd moved to as well. So the Viking Age is all about movement, people moving everywhere, and a lot of those changes coming in of Europe becoming what it is now through that as well.
Well, we talk about this because the Vanguard Guards, they came from that point. So how did the Vanguard Guards become a thing? I'm kind of stumped a little bit on that.
So obviously, when you have the split of the Roman Empire, so you have your east, you have your west. The east reconquers most of the west, but just not northwest Europe. But it's got Spain, Spain, Portugal, Italy, most of North Africa, the islands, all across there, obviously, in Greece, Anatolia, down through into Egypt. So that part of the Roman Empire, I think before Caesar, Roman Empire, they rebuilt that. They did that very, very quickly. But the problem they had was they were still having these big movements of people coming in. And then there was a lot of political turmoil going on at the same time. So these armies were pretty much, they changed up the military in that time period. And they had the Limitanii and the Comitates, which, so the first one are border guards. Think National Guard in the US, really, really great way of doing this. Same sort of thing. They're essentially the same sort of soldiers, could fight in the same battles with other soldiers, but their primary purpose is to live their normal lives. But if you need soldiers in that area, you can call them up and then you've got a ready-made army. There were obviously some career soldiers that came to form the core of these armies, but that's generally how they were. Comitates were a lot of horse-based military going around as well. It's when the Romans really lent into cavalry, which they'd never really done before. And the whole idea of that was they could run up and down the borders and go, right, cool, we need another army here. Right, cool, drop this in. Think of modern airborne troops or Marines. You can get them, deploy them quickly, and they're the really good soldiers that you can get there, and then they'll hold that until you can build up this bigger force to fight the bigger battles. So they changed to this style of military, but that meant that they were involved in more battles. They'd had to do this to be involved in more battles, and they were using a far more of this citizen population in the Limitanii to fight these battles. There was one point where the Balkans was basically there weren't civilians left later on in the Roman Empire, in the east of Roman Empire, and they started losing these lands to intrigue, everything that goes on in Italy as well with, can't remember his name, Belisarius? Possibly, Belisarius.
Possibly, yeah.
On that one, yeah. There's that whole thing with Justinian where there's intrigue to try, and it ruins all of that. But then you have the plague. The Black Death comes about. These plagues, it destroys populations because you've got these weaker populations in the areas because it's far more urbanized in Eastern Rome. Because you think it's more akin to the Middle East than the Western Empire. Now, the Western Empire, you take somewhere like Britain, London, relatively important place in Britannia, but essentially it's a bit of a backwater. Like just south of me, in Caliva Atrabatum, was actually more important than London for a long time. London was only important because it was a big dock.
Right.
but as a cultural population center, it still wasn't up there with everything as well. So you had these places in Western Europe that were population centers, but generally it was very dispersed. The problem is, as soon as you start getting plagues, when you've got a very urbanized structure, is they spread very, very fast. We've got modern medicine, so we mitigate that by, in an urban setting, we can get vaccines and treatment and larger hospitals into those areas very quickly, whereas obviously back then they didn't have all of those things. So you end up with them struggling with this this population. They have this sort of population decline and stagnation. So they end up, because they've got a lot of money, and that's one of the big things. If you remember from a lot of the stuff from the earlier Roman Empire, you wanted to be a proconsul in the East because it's the wealth, the fantastic wealth that they had. So they ended up going like Carthage did, where they would build their armies with a lot of mercenaries that they could do.
Yes.
The Varangians were one of those group of mercenaries, because one of the big things about the Vikings, and people always think of them as these, oh, they come in, they kill a lot of people, and they steal stuff. Yes, they did do that, but initially they're traders. They were trading. So Viking comes from the term to go a Viking. It's actually a verb that turned into a noun. It came from a very small town in eastern Sweden, southeastern Sweden, just across from Gotland, actually. Very close, weirdly close to Gotland. That's bizarre, I just realised that. But then it spread out from there, and the whole idea was that the farmland was difficult up there because of the inheritance laws. It was getting smaller, and parcels of land passed on. So it became difficult because their population was successful, healthy, so it was growing, but they didn't have anywhere for these people to go. So one of the ways to build that is to go out and trade, to be a part of other people's, to set up towns, hence this expansion into what we then get as the Kievan Rus, into Muscovy becoming a thing, with this amalgamation of the people that are already there and these what we call Vikings, just for ease of work, in there. But as they're going down, they get to the Black Sea, and then, well, you're into Byzantine territory at that point. So they then start trading with the Byzantines. Obviously, the Byzantines are really focused on money and trade to build this up, because, as I've said before, they had the finances to do that. So you end up with this strong connection. A lot of the amber in that area of the world obviously came from Scandinavia. But Scandinavia and all that, the territory going into what is now Russia, that entire band, that's where you get a lot more amber. So that was a big trade good coming through. Obviously, then you had raids and you had slaves as well. There was a big slave market in a lot of these places at the time. So they then take them through. What you end up then happening is, it was only because it was a tough journey. You only got the strongest and the biggest and best, essentially, that got there. So one of the other things is they want to earn money. It's we see it in immigration to the modern day. You want to earn money, and if you're from a poorer country, you've got knowledge and skills that are relevant in another country. You go to that country, use those knowledge and skills, and with their greater economy, you live about your means or below your means as much as possible. You save that money up, and then you take that home, and then you live like a king where you're from, because you have that extra money, or you use that money to set up a decent life and bring people with you. So have these two options, and that's always been the thing. And it's the same thing that happens with the Vikings. But because they were so good and there were bands of them, they were then brought in as these easy-to-use mercenaries as well.
And it's interesting because I played Medieval 2 Total War, and it's like you got a combination of Roman-style soldiers along with Viking-style soldiers. It's like an interesting combination. I mean, and here's a picture of what a Vanguardian guard might have looked like back in the day. You know, he's got the Roman style, armor, but you can clearly tell he's a Viking. He's not a.
It's the aspects of this. So you've got for the Viking, obviously they've got the tattoos linked to the Vikings. You've got the axe. That's
The
the bearded
road,
axe.
the paint, the war paint. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's even the chainmail to the certain extent of the use of it was the Vikings had this. This goes back to some of the early stuff in Beowulf about
Dungeon
the
Death.
nets.
William Rubens. And he's
Funny you
asking
say that
even.
is.
Sounds like the cows are coming for one of you, but which one?
Wasn't cops, it's an ambulance. I live next to a hospital. But this is the main road for the police as well. So yes, I have all of that. But funny you say very French. We'll get to that later, Dungeon Dan.
Very French.
Because there's a big connection there. So you get these connections. You've got these very Byzantine things as well. It's like the splint armor on the legs, the strips of armor linked together. That's very Byzantine. Scale is also very, and also the cloak. That's ambulance. The cloak as well is, if you remember from with the Romans, the togas, where you'd have a different size purple stripe or a purple toga,
Right.
or red stripes to a certain extent. And those where they signified who you were. Cloaks were a thing for the Byzantines. Also something called crossbow brooches, which is a certain specific style of brooch that was given to soldiers and was sort of a form of a medal at points as well. So you had this style of that short cape becoming a thing of it'd be the equivalent of say your parade dress in a modern military. That's what the cape would be used for. But that then does come out of that they would wear those sort of things into battle as well in winter when on campaign. They may remove them. Obviously, it stops the rain getting on your armor and rusting it. And obviously, Vikings, seaborne warriors, and we all know what living by the sea does to your car. Well, armor's no different to a car at those purposes, and they didn't have all of the lacquered paint that we have on cars these days to protect it. So you have this very practical thing that then becomes part of formal dress as well. But it's a combination of various different cultures all coming together, because Byzantium, by that point, it's this crossroads of Western culture, as we think of Western Roman culture, then heavily influenced by the Greek culture. Because remember, they're not speaking Latin, they're speaking Greek in Byzantium. The Eastern Empire spoke Greek, which was where there was a big difference as well. But obviously, the higher-ups often spoke Latin as well. You then have it being right up against Anatolia, a large swathe. And even later on, the majority of Byzantine lands were Anatolia. So you're starting getting into the Persian and the Arabic different influences coming. Even the Pashnid influence was huge. Depending where you get into the empire.
Now, Aiden, I got an interesting question for you. Bit of a tangent, but just hear me out. We talked about the Praetorian Guard before, right? And they both wore purple, right? Both of them wore purple. So the question I got for you and Dan, by the way, and Dan can jump on in as well. Which one you think will win in a battle, the Bactrian Guard or the Praetorian Guard? Which will win in a battle? That should be a fun one.
That's a super difficult question.
That's a fun one. Yes.
It depends when you're talking about the Praetorian Guard. Before the Praetorian Guard were just pretty soldiers who stood around the emperor. They were essentially an elite legion.
That one. That's the one I'm talking about. That.
An elite legion against what is at their bare bones.
It's a good question.
Barbarians with decent armor. However, the Varangians also had legionary training. Interestingly, we know about legionary camps through the Notitia Dignitatum, Byzantine military handbook. I had that on my desk and read it every day for about 2 years. Not because I'm a weirdo, but because, it's nearly 3 years, because it was very relevant to my undergraduate dissertation while I was studying through my undergraduate into my master's. It's got even down to what colour the shields were, everything. It is, if you imagine a modern military handbook, that's what it was. The Byzantines were obsessed with handbooks. They were absolutely obsessed. Sidetrack here. They would, one of the things that upper class would do, so you get in modern culture where you become a celebrity and you write an autobiography or a self-help book. Well, the Byzantines wouldn't. They'd write a handbook. So they used to write books on gardening or how to have your military or on finance, all those. You think about it, the For Dummies series. That's a Byzantine invention, really. They were doing all of that. And it came obviously to the military, the Notitia Dignitatum. So it was very specific in there. It had all of the. If you lost your spearhead, then you would be executed. That was the punishment for it. So obviously people didn't lose their spears, which has one of the reasons. I remember that one. It's very specific in archaeology that if you find spearheads, there's very different reasons. They're not accidentally lost. Otherwise, we'd then have the records of them dying. Because of all of that military background, the Varangians are essentially this powerful barbarian people, as far as the Praetorians would be concerned. But they've got all of that Roman military training, and they would hold until the blast. I think the Varangians have it. The Varangians are crap against cavalry.
I know. Look, don't you say both guards are wearing purple. They really have to know who the federal warriors are. Seems like a friendly fire, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong.
There's a major difference to this because the Praetorians at that height would be wearing lorica segmentata. They would have either oval, hexagonal, or the oblong shields. The blue more. Yes, we could. But the Varangians would have been using the Viking shields. So they've had the circular shields. The armor would have been different. You're talking scale. The Praetorians did use lorica hamata, their version of scale that we saw in that picture. So there'd be that similarity. Also, the Romans were very famous for being clean shaven. It's only that period around Hadrian where they actually wore beards, whereas the Vikings, other way around, they would have beards, and that was kind of what they were supposed to. Like in the French army with their sappers, that they have to have giant beards. It's actually part of the uniform to have that for the parade ones anyway. So you have this visual distinctiveness between the two, fortunately, as well. And obviously, the Praetorians wore longer skirts to hide their boobs.
My God, Duncan says the baggy pants disputes. Duncan. All right, so I think we've spoken enough about the Vagian Guard. Let's kind of move on a little closer to England. I'm sure you heard about the Great Heathen Army, also known as the Viking Great Army, the coalition of Scandinavian warriors who invaded England in 865 AD.
I know. Yes, there's a very important point about that. Where I live right now is the first time that the Viking army overwintered, so stayed over. Usually they come raid and then go home for winter. That's the first time they overwintered. It's why where I live exists. Reading only exists because of that, because they set up camp here. And that is the whole reason for the town I live in to exist. And they set up camp about half a mile that way. So yeah, it's a very big. So the Great Heathen Army this is a change within the Vikings as well, moving on from that trading to the raiding, and then on to being armies that could actually stand up and fight people. They were better warriors. When you're talking about the small scale conflict, it was very difficult to deal with them as well, because one of the other things is the Vikings, the ones that you see are those elite warriors. Think of it for the US the US is another great example of this. When you see the US invading another country, they don't start by sending in the National Guard. They start by sending in the Marines and the Paras. We do the same thing. You're getting the hardest warriors turning up first, and they will basically destroy anything that's equal in numbers for most nations that are invaded, and then all of the other part comes from the other general units rather than the elite units that go in first. Now, the Vikings, up until the Great Heathen Army, were just those elite units. You're only fighting those elite units, and you're fighting them with essentially your home guard, because they're turning up, they could be turning up anywhere. So you've got your National Guard or your Home Guard or your reservists, they're there, they go grab their weapons to go and fight them. Yes, the Vikings can be beaten, they can be bought off, sometimes people can win against them, but generally.
And there's the symbol of the Great Heathen Army. That was the symbol. And in fact, if you play as Denmark in Medieval 2 Total War, that's the faction symbol for Denmark.
Oh, yeah. So I am drinking Danish beer right now. Just
perfect.
Yeah. So
perfect.
And let me just check the can, because sometimes you find symbols. So Danish Royal Crest. The Danish Royal Crest actually comes from this time period as well.
And Dungeon Dan came up with a simple point. I think the Vikings were the original shock and awe fighters.
If you're talking from a Marine's perspective, 100%.
I mean, the Marine aspect,
But from a general battlefield perspective, no, I think the Romans, and obviously we go back to our horse archers that we absolutely adore.
I don't think so. I definitely think that. I think Persia with their horse archers were the first really. No, actually, I got one better for you. The Hittites, the chariots of the Hittites.
Yeah, Hittite chariots, which goes back to the if you go back in history, the very first recorded battle in history. That's where we get the first shock and awe.
The Battle of Kadesh. Yeah, so so maybe the Persians were first. I say the Hittites were first, but the thing is, a lot of people don't know who the Hittites are. So you really got to be a nerd to know who the Hittites are.
And as Battle of Kadesh, who won the Battle of Kadesh? That's a big question here. Both sides, because they both claimed victory.
Exactly.
So, but I just want to come back to something that Dan said. The brutality was unseen before that. Now, this goes back into this mystique of the Vikings, and I think it's a very big thing about the Vikings we need to talk about. So, the brutality was seen before that. It was seen repeatedly before that. Some of what the Vikings did was actually learnt behavior, not just what they were doing. It was a relative norm. One of the big things was we're seeing those stories by the written record, and the written record at that time was by the monks who were getting brutalized by these people coming in. They would kill them. They would do unspeakable acts to them, and going into the whole gamut. There was no holds barred when it came to that. That wasn't uncommon. That was the norm for it. It's just what the monks were doing, and what the English. They weren't the English, ironically, until the Great Heathen Army had done its thing. The English didn't become a formal thing. Until that point, what the Anglo-Saxons are trying to do is they're trying to become more civilized, as it were, trying to bring back that. Well, we're connected to Rome, we're trying to get the trade, we're trying to create a bigger, more formal society, because the big leaders, especially with Christianity as well, this is where the laws of war come from, how you treat people, a lot of that comes from that, which leads obviously to the later in the Crusades thing, you're not allowed to kill people until the Pope tells you to.
Right.
It's actually a very real thing that happens. You get this all throughout history, but we're only hearing it from that perspective. And so you get this, it's this myth. It's like if you watch, if you're watching news on a news channel, and that news channel happens to be biased in one way or the other, politically or from a country perspective, you're going to see the other side as the other. They're the enemy. They're coming. They're doing unspeakable acts. And then when you do similar, it's they were hiding behind these civilians. We didn't want to kill the civilians, but accidentally these were killed. We've tried to send humanitarian aid, but they're not letting them. Whereas that's the same story from the other side, but it's trying to make them seem more evil than they are. That also because they wouldn't respect Christian places. They hadn't really heard of Christianity. Christianity never made it to the Vikings until this period. They came and found Christianity when they were wandering around. They went, oh, look at that. But you've got to remember, these are people that didn't have the Romans. There was some Roman trade with them, and they were interacting. They weren't Christians.
How would the exploits of the Vikings known prior to Christian monks' documentation? Was it all word of mouth, or was it put into art, murals?
There's art and murals, not so much. There is certain documentation. The weird thing about these monks is they were around from before the Roman Empire left. That's when they really get their start, and they're starting to write these things as well.
Yeah, don't forget the Roman Empire already founded Christianity. Waiting for the Vikings.
So you've already got all of this, all of these records. So when you're trying to become more Romanized, as it were, because they were trying to essentially re-Romanize themselves weirdly, they're picking up on these Germanic barbarians. And so all of those stories just stick by word of mouth. So while we see it written later on, a lot of it was transmitted earlier on by just stories and people telling things. And as you know, the more you tell people something, it just grows and grows, the telling of that story, those oral traditions of people moving things around. So earlier Vikings really don't appear as much because earlier on as well, they're trading. So they're just known as these weird trading people. So you get certain descriptions of them. You also get descriptions from the Middle East. You've got to remember one of the biggest cultural center in the West during this time period was actually Baghdad. That's where the idea of chivalry is born, is actually in Baghdad, center of science, the hub of science, and this idea that you go out and you explore. So the only reason we know about Viking funerary rituals, so how they did their funerals, was actually from the works of Ibn Fadlan, who went the other way, went to Byzantium and then upwards, which was played by the Seventh Warrior or something, or Fifth Warrior. I can't remember the name of the film now. Played by Antonio Banderas as well, of all people. So you end up with this attribute because the Viking runic script wasn't a write it down on paper. It's more of a thing that you're going to get carved into stones and things. So if you're carving it into stone, you're only going to write the really important stuff. Generally, it's going to be this guy was great. It's going to be a funeral monument type of thing, or a religious monument. You're not going to go through the effort of writing your shopping list on a stone slab. Unless you're really
going on Dungeon Dance's point, from the Christian point of view, the Vikings were evil, and it makes sense. Just like the Muslims, under south of Spain were considered evil. The Moors, Egypt when it made a transformation into Islam, Egypt, and then you had the Turks. So I thought really that the Christians, the Catholic Church even hated Orthodox Christians of the East. Which is another subject we're going to have to get. I don't want to get into that. That's a whole other can of worms. The Catholics against the Orthodox.
What's really interesting in this is the Vikings actually had a big connection to the Orthodox Church, obviously being branching God.
Like you were discussing.
So these weren't proper Christians either. So if they went to any Christians and went, they'd go, they're not proper Christians anyway. Because they had this dispute. On top of that, really think about it. We call this giant Viking army, we call it the Great Heathen Army. Right. Heathen meaning non-Christian.
Exactly.
They're people that don't believe in Christianity. They're clearly some sort of
to build off Dungeon Dance's point, right? To build off Dungeon Dance's point, we might have found quite the irony here. We might think the Crusades was the first holy war. I gotta say that I think this battle against the Vikings might have been a holy war in itself, in a very subtle way. That is, in a subtle way. But I think it kind of qualifies as a holy conflict.
it's what's really interesting is later on when you get the Danish kings, because obviously their southern border borders on what is Christian lands, so they've got this interaction with them as a more of a kingdom, say, part of both worlds. When they become Christianized as well, they end up getting sanctioned, excommunicated for fighting against other Christian nations, and
Yes.
it's called upon other Christian nations to topple their leadership and bring that back, which is the essence of a crusade, of bring this land back into Christianity. Once it's become Christian, that's then a lost land from then on forward. Once it's become this Christian land, that, as I said, with most of Scandinavia, it hadn't become Christian yet. So
yeah, it was a large pagan. It was very pagan, back in the day. Now, eventually, they did become Catholic. Eventually,
yeah. It's and that was partly through marriages. There's a great story about one of the Viking pirates in the Channel, and they would either be executed for their piracy, or they could submit to God and become a Christian and no longer attack Christians. And the quote from this pirate captain is, he was like 7th or 9th time this had happened to him. Like, oh, what's one more time? It won't hurt. And they release him and he just carry on doing it because he knew it was a get out clause. And it took them like it was between 7 or 9 times. I can't remember which it was. It's like, it wasn't until that point they were like, yeah, hang on a minute. Like, this guy isn't really becoming a Christian. Again, the Viking series really, really does this well. Ironically, with Rollo, who is someone we should talk about as well, because Rollo is the guy who sets up the Normans after attacking Paris. He is then, because the Vikings are causing so much trouble in these what will become French lands, they then bring them on board to protect against the others. You've also got to remember the Anglo-Saxons were also Vikings who just come across. A lot of that territory that was conquered, they're the same people. You've got Dublin set up as a trading port by these same people. You end up with the British Isles, literally the Anglo-Saxons are in this area in the south that I'm in. It's just Wessex really that's left. The rest of it is effectively controlled by Vikings. And then even with the pushback, you've got over half of the of Great Britain controlled by the Vikings for a few hundred years. It's not a small amount of time. And then when eventually they get pushed back and pushed out, it's not very long afterwards till the Normans turn up. And as obviously we've just talked about, those Normans are the same Vikings. They've just been in France for a little bit more and gone, oh, look, you got horses. Let's use them. And then turned up with that. And then the Normans, this is why the Normans carried on essentially doing what the Vikings did. They just did it on horseback instead. And then that leads into later history with the Byzantines. All right, this is an interesting thing with the Varangian Guard. So after 1066, with the Normans defeating the Saxons at Senlac Hill, Battle of Hastings, those lords would go off and then find somewhere else. A lot of them joined the Varangian Guard. It was actually led at one point by Harold Hardrada, who, as we know, was the guy who invaded in 1066, and that all fell apart. But a lot of them went and fought with the Varangian Guard. There was then a later battle against the Normans, where the Byzantines didn't pay the Normans, and then the Normans attacked them, so they hired more Normans, and then they fought against them, and then they didn't pay them either. This did very Carthage feeling here right now.
Yes.
Yeah. So you end up with this battle of the Byzantine army fighting against these Normans that eventually defeat them. But one of the reasons for that is the Varangian Guard are so angry at these Normans, they refuse to retreat from their position. They're like, no, we're not retreating. We're just going to fight them to the death. Because so many of them were either these Vikings, it's the same mentality going on, that so many of the Varangian Guard at that point were veterans of Senlac Hill. They were these Anglo-Saxons. They were trying to get revenge. And, well, they didn't really. It's like, you just proved a hill or not, you're just losing, mate. Like, they were going to get destroyed. So you've got this, it's a mix of populations. Sort of like it's just who moved where, when at this point. But they're all the same group of tribes mixing in. But it shows once again, how the British Isles have been mixed with different cultures and different peoples moving in time and time and time and time again. from as soon as the Romans get here, and we've got the records of that as well. So you've got the Romans turning up, then you've got the big movement of peoples around the Roman Empire. Then after that, you've got the Saxons coming in with the Saxon shore forts used to defend against the early attacks of these Scandinavians. The Vikings were attacking during the Roman Empire. That was the thing.
Right.
The Vikings were attacking the Romans. That's how the Saxon shore forts came up, because they were
Yeah,
trying to stop the other
correct.
Saxons getting in, who we later become to term as the Vikings because they're Danish
Yeah.
as well. They're coming in. They eventually come
Well,
in. They
total
settle.
war,
They become the
barbarian invasion.
Yep, they become the Anglo-Saxons.
Yep.
Once the Anglo-Saxons then settle
Yep.
and become more, as we would term, civilized, but urbanized is a better term for it. You then get the other surge of people coming across, who are the same group of people coming across later. They're fighting through. They then lose to them and then win against them eventually. Then the other group of them that have settled become the Normans. They then invade again. So you get the same groups of people. If you do a genetic analysis, there is almost nothing to distinguish between an Anglo-Saxon, a Norman, and a Viking. They're all basically the same people. They're just where they ended up settling and when they ended up settling. That is the only difference between those groups, really.
Now, I want to switch subjects because Dungeon Dan came up with an interesting scenario here. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Vikings getting credit for figuring out how to navigate across the ocean with the sunboard and crystal. Now, don't get me wrong, it's impressive, but I feel that was knowledge gained by them from another culture.
So this goes back to the whole connection between Byzantium being in the east, and Baghdad being a hub of science. So that all those Roman scientific achievements, you've still got them enshrined within the Byzantine Empire. So, a lot of them are obviously from the Greek science that's come through. That was one of the reasons the Romans improved. That's still part of that never falls until very late on with the Byzantines falling. They have this connection to what was originally the Persians, as we thought of it under the Roman Empire earlier on, but is this mix of cultures and the Arabic cultures. So you have this idea of they're making things. So the early batteries that come out, the Baghdad battery as a thing, that's early experimentation in electricity and using science and playing with those ideas. So this idea of navigation, and you think about it, we're thinking about it from a European perspective. But think about where Baghdad is. Baghdad's where it is because that's a connection between east and west, not over land but over sea. You go down through the Iranian Gulf, and then you go across, and then what the trade routes in India. Again, India, a place where you've got this mix of cultures, but again, you've got this science moving up, and then you've got the connections that even have some hints back to the Greeks to a certain extent through Alexander the Great as well. So you get this where they're trading, and the Indian Ocean's massive. So you've got that, and then they're going over. They get to test in the Mediterranean as well to see if this stuff works. And then the Vikings were ship-based people, so they were taking this technology and going, well, let's do that. You've also got to remember with a lot of these technologies and with any new technology, it takes a handful of people who go, well, I don't care if I die doing this, I'm going to go and do it. And then just going out, your chances of survival being small, like the first man in space. Prime example of this. All the other people that tried to cross the ocean and we never ever heard about because, well, they died, and people are like, oh, well, he got on a boat, went that way, and we never heard from him again. That's not really a thing. It's when it actually happens and it gets there. So obviously when they get Iceland, once you've got Iceland, they're used to sailing around icy waters. Their entire societal structure, culture, and the way that they use their boats and the land that they can survive on. They're already living in that climate. So all they're doing is they're moving across that climate. So actually, weirdly enough, winter's a good time to do that if you can survive in those climates because you've got more ice around. So you've got land, as it were, so that you can sail around that. You've got a coast, you've got fixed points as well. So this technology, and where you've got the Kiev and Rus and Muscovy, and going around down the Volga, you've got the Byzantines, and then you've got all of this stuff coming up from Baghdad as well. This whole cultural and scientific connection from the east comes up through the Vikings, and they just picked the bit of it that they needed, which was this expansion. They wanted to expand and find lands where they could settle and farm and expand their culture, because they had this impetus to do that. Hence why they were in the British Isles in the first place. Hence why their islands north of Scotland, some of them are Norwegian, and some of them are technically Scottish, but it's easy enough culturally, and also even go down to genetics as well. They could be Norwegian. There has been discussion about them ceding to Norway at points and going through. Do you remember? But obviously, this Danish-Norwegian empire that ends up being a thing that controls everything from Greenland across. They still got Greenland. Scandinavia's got a border with Canada, and they did that, and then obviously get into Finland. So we've got evidence. We know that they did that. But it took those people, and that was the whole thing about the Vikings, is they were the people who had the balls to go and do that thing. That's why they went and did that, and they took that technology, and with the technology they had for their boats, because they were designed for that type of sea, they were able to use it and then push on forwards. You think all the other cultures, the Romans, they never needed that. You're in the Mediterranean. Like, the Mediterranean is essentially a pond compared to the North Atlantic. Its size, how flat it is, the inclement weather, the coastlines, everything that is so much easier in the Mediterranean than it is over in the North Sea. But they've been used to sailing around the North Sea already, whereas the other cultures hadn't, so you would have had to improve that technology more and more. It's one of the reasons that the Egyptians took a long time to head up to Greece, because a lot of they had boats from very early on. They were just for going up and down the Nile, made from reeds. That's not going to survive a trip even across the Mediterranean. So you don't have this level of technology to be able to make use of those navigation techniques. You need people who are used to the technology of the boats and the navigational techniques to be able to put them together to be able to do that. And that's how we see it through the Vikings.
Yeah, pretty much it. That's pretty much the truth, Dungeon. Yep. I want to show you. I have something interesting to show you. Let me see. I'll pull it up here. Share the screen. It's a pretty good map. I make this map from the 800s. This was Europe, and you got all the different tribes. Yeah, I know it's a little hard to see. Oh, here we go. So yeah, you can see England. You had the Saxons, the Welsh. You had different tribes, and you had the Scandinavians here. What I like about this map, it kind of breaks down Europe, into the different tribes of different. Europe was a very different world back in the 800s. Over here you had the Franks. Over here the Saxons had control the north here, and then you had the Slavs. So compared to medieval times, Europe was a very different world, and this is what they like to call the Dark Age. This is what they like to call the Dark Ages. And
what I
know how
find
I feel about
very interesting about this map is how very close to modern borders a lot of it is. When you really think about it, is apart from the top parts of Norway, that's Norway, that's Denmark. It's a few of those islands,
Sweden,
but has the culture through Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, up into Denmark. Culturally, we're actually very, very similar. Then you've got France, obviously Brittany. You've got the Celtic areas.
Yeah, Brittany right here. Yeah, that little part right there with the mouse. Yeah, it was a little hard to see, but yeah, but I know what you're talking about.
Italy is Italy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is there. You can see where that comes from. The Bulgarian Empire, obviously that would be, grey bit.
Yep, right here. The Bulgarians, the Bulgar Empire. Then so the Byzantines, the Byzantines in the purple, of course.
Which is obvious, where you've got what is now Greece, and then
the Berbers, and then down here's the Berbers.
So you can actually see a lot of the original borders. And what's the interesting one is where Germany turned into many different states and then amalgamated from these Germanic peoples. You have obviously is Persia at this time where people are going west, but it's interesting to see that Germany's made up of so many different
peoples. Italy, this is what they call the you remember the Lombardy tribe, the Lombards. They took over Italy at one point. This belonged to the Lombards, which was of course some people say it's kind of part Viking.
The Lombards were eventually it was the Normans destroyed. So where you see the areas in the very south, where you've got Sicily and then the boot of Italy.
Yep.
That's actually the areas that the Normans ended up holding. And then that's one of the routes for the Crusades to go through the Mediterranean across these areas the Normans had, because it was their cousins, literally their cousins.
And then you even have all the way up here where the woods are coming. This was Iceland. You even had Iceland. They had the monks up there. But Iceland wasn't really a big deal back then. Iceland became a bigger deal in the later ages. Iceland became a bigger deal in history.
See, one of the groups that's interesting is the Wends.
The Wends, yes.
Yeah, the Wends is if you go into Beowulf, the whole idea of these monsters attacking them is actually linked to the Vikings fighting against the Wends. Now, if you look at where they are, doesn't that make perfect sense of why that was happening? And obviously, that little bit in between them and the Saxons is mixed. It's a mixture of both. But you got this border between those worlds.
You got the Bavian kingdom right here. In this part is the Bavians. Bavians. But which was part of Germany. Then you had in here you had the like you said, it's mixed. And then, but what the most interesting one is the Khazars. Because the Khazars were the ones who are now the Rus' interest into the Byzantine Empire. They were a trading faction, and they were the Rus had to cross through Khazar lands to get to the Byzantines and serve the Byzantine Empire as the guides.
And one of the that's one of the core routes of heavily armored heavy cavalry, and that's where one of the groups.
It's interesting because the Khazars would eventually became the Cumans in later times. The Cumans.
You get that's all these horse tribes pushing against each other, which just squishes things. And France, what we think of as now as France, if you think of that blue area, is that being squished west because of this pressure from the east that comes in with these people, and you end up with this, and that's why you get these differences between. That map also really shows the difference between what's Northern Europe and what's not Northern Europe. So you've got Northern, Middle, and Southern Europe, and it shows how there's that weird distinctiveness of.
It was a weird time. The 800s, it was a weird time in Europe. It was
fascinating ones as well.
It was the development of what would be Europe, but it was through the developing. And it's like historians might call it the Dark Ages. They might call it the Dark Ages, but it's really not that dark, man. It's really a renaissance. I like to call it a renaissance of because everything was ancient Rome, but now that Rome fell, it was giving birth to a whole new generation of nations.
Yeah. So the term the Dark Ages, people often mischaracterize that. Dark Ages literally to do with, you think of illuminated manuscripts. So you're illuminated by reading. There's connection when you look at the words. It's the Dark Ages were a mixture of the time where we don't have written records. There aren't written records, so it's dark from a historical perspective because it's at a time we don't have the records from. That's literally, it's literally just a functional title, but also it's connected to Christianity because that area is now non-Christian. So if you think about the way the basic Christian mantra goes is the illumination of the dark. As well as part of that as well, hence illuminated manuscripts, and all of this stuff comes in together. Hence why we think of Dark Ages as a weird term, but literally, even though it was come up with in the 1800s by a Dane, I do believe, it's either Victorians or the Danes. A lot of how we have our museums and how the ages are done are by the Danish National Museum. As well as one guy there who was blatantly autistic and wanted to organise everything. So he named it all so he could organise it. So the Dark Ages were that group because of the records. He didn't have the records, therefore everything that didn't have historical records went into that group as well.
Yep, and it's funny because even during Roman times, you had the Celts, and they believed in the Norse mythology, which is connected to the Vikings, to Scandinavian mythology, like Thor, all those are those mythical characters.
Yeah. Well, if you look at it's the other thing with the Anglo-Saxons, and it shows how close they were. You just change around a few letters because of the tribal dialects, and you've got exactly the same gods. You've got Woden. Look at the names for the days of the week. That really shows the influence as well. It's obviously today is one of the Roman ones, Saturn, obviously
right.
Saturday, Sunday. Well, we can all work out where that comes from. But they look at Thursday, Thor's Day. They all come from Wednesday, Woden's Day, Odin's Day, the day of Woden, the god as well. And you get when you get into it, you realise that the names of the days of the week are actually come from the Scandinavian and Germanic gods.
Right. I honestly didn't know that. So we learned something new today. At least I did. I did not know that. So it's a really good point, man.
Here's a weird one.
Go ahead.
Primary school teacher in P4, which is about year 3 for me, was called Mrs. Thursby. Now, Thursby is an interesting name because the BY part means village. Thurs is from the same roots, Thor's village. She came from a Viking village. This was in Ireland. She was very Irish. It showed how much contact that they had in Ireland, but you still had those names knocking around when I was at school, and that was about 93, 94. So it's obviously very recent, but that was a known thing as well back then, that connection.
Okay, that's interesting to know. We're getting very close to the end here, Aiden. There's one more question I want to ask. You're probably going to know more than I do. Is there a significant Scandinavian population in England, or is there a significant Viking? People who are proud of Viking heritage, the Scandinavian heritage in England.
So if you go further north and east, obviously I said about the islands north of Scotland, you've still got a lot of that coming into it, especially that connection with Norway. But the idea of the blonde hair, blue eyed Scandinavian, if you look culturally, if you look at that spread across the UK from a genetic standpoint, you can actually see that. And also it comes into the way we say certain words. Obviously the dialects in Britain change very, very quickly, and they change distinctively in different areas. So even down to, do you know why in the US they're called pants rather than trousers? That's actually the same in if you go up to Birmingham and around that area, they will spell mum with no frequently, and everyone's going, well, it's just the US culture because there's a lot of immigration into the area, and obviously immigrants tend to learn American rather than English. It's not. It actually goes really far back into that's just how that developed in that area, whereas the South and West, and if you look at that difference in how things are in those pronunciations, you can actually there's some mapping that works quite well with what was Danelaw and what was owned by the Anglo-Saxons at the time and how that culture changed. York being a classic example of this, of an area, obviously being Jorvik, having that slightly different edge to it as well. So you'll find more of that. There's it's more regional in the UK now. If you delve into it, though, it then does, when you start to go back, you go, well, actually, that starts to go back to more Scandinavian. But when you go back that far with smaller things, it's very hard to distinguish because, obviously, as I said, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans still had a lot of that in their culture. Like blonde hair and blue eyes could mean you were Norman. If you look at my family, on my mum's side, the family name's Wyard. It's been Wyard since they invaded the UK in 1066. They are a Norman family. They're all the way through. The men who take after on that side of the family, being 6'2" is short. My mum's uncle's 7 foot tall. They're all blonde hair, blue eyed. I take after my dad's side more, which is a more Saxon family. Hence why I'm slightly shorter, darker, curly hair, but I've still got blue grey eyes that comes from my mum's side through that route. So you get this, the Saxons mix more with the Celtic populations as well.
Right.
But you then get the weirdness in my family that I'm O negative, and O is a strong blood group amongst Celtic people as well. My wife's O negative, obviously, but Irish descendants, and I've got Irish descendants on certain parts of my family. However, you still have this very strong in certain families where you've got either this Scandinavian or Norman sort of coloration and physical attributes that come out.
I just thought of this question. One quick question before we end it. Is there a connection between the Celts and the Vikings? Is Celtic culture connected to Norse Scandinavian culture, or is there a difference?
Not really. So
I don't mean to cut you off. I only asked because I'm sure the Romans looked at Celts and Vikings. They would have looked at them the same way, like barbarians.
Yeah. So the things you think, obviously, the Celts and the Germanic peoples were differentiated. The Vikings and so the Scandinavian peoples were more lumped in with that Germanic origin. And those tribes who were still seen as Celts to a certain extent, because Celt was just anybody wasn't really Roman, hence why you get we've talked about this before with Celts with beards, Celts with trousers, Celts with this, Celts who lived over there.
It's like I think of it this way: it's like comparing Romans to Greeks.
Yeah. It's there. When you look at it a little bit, you can kind of tell. But there's things. So you had the Beaker people. And then the Celts came in, invaded, and essentially killed off a lot of those people and took over the lands. And this is what I'm saying, you get this pressure from the east of tribes moving further west. This one of the reasons for white people being called Caucasians. Most of it comes from the Caucasus Mountains, this influence. So you get at that early period, you get what is the culture of the Celtic peoples comes across Europe. And then obviously Southern Europe around the Mediterranean kind of stays similar culture, even in southern Spain. But essentially they become Celts. Galicia essentially, their instruments, the bagpipe, which shows you the Celtic link all across Western Europe. You then get the Germanic peoples coming across, collapse of the Roman Empire, Germanic peoples push across. So you've got this tiny Celtic fringe now. And then you get the horse tribes coming across and they push through over to, and this is why Germany becomes weird and why in the First World War they were called the Huns, because the Huns were the horse tribes. And it was that link back to the Saxon peoples being forced west out of Germany by these horse tribes coming from the east, forcing everyone towards the west and hitting the Atlantic seaboard, and there was nowhere else to go. So you have this bit across the north with Scandinavia and going through obviously to Finland and Russia. You have this bit in the south with Italy, the islands, little bits of Spain, bits of North Africa going across through Greece into what we now know as sort of like areas like Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria,
Right.
all of those areas. And even Turkey as well has a lot of this culture coming in. But then the Turks were another one who came in afterwards. So you get that push through. So you get these groups, but through that funnel of Central Europe, you then get this movement of people. So actually, the Germanic peoples and the Celtic peoples were separate because the Romans come in at that point where the Germanic peoples are pushing the Celtic peoples further west. Hence why the Britons and the English are technically the same people when you go back to that part of history, because the English are the Germanic peoples, the Britons are the Celtic peoples because they're from Britannia, but you get this push. So the gods only really connect when you go back to that the religions of the time. They were more nature based. So you'd have a god of, say, thunder, storms, wind, things like that. Thor are examples there. You then get the water gods. This is where we get the Solus and Minerva thing with the Romans and the Celts. So you get the religion of the time. There is those connections that are made, but however, they are distinctive groups of people that are pushing against each other. And why you do get a mix, because they've been around each other for so long, they're actually two different groups of people, and you actually do see the differences when you go into things like genetics as well. You can actually tell the difference of where people have got some of this from. But if you tested anyone from around, say, England, you're going to get a strong mix of both because everyone was mixed together. It's the Celtic peoples didn't disappear. They weren't massacred. They were always there. It's just culturally, they've been so put down by the Romans that this stronger Germanic culture came in, and they went, well, we have our aspects of it, and then they melded those together. Hence why you then get some of the stuff. Even, well, I did earlier, but you get insular art, which is a good example of merging cultures and artworks as well. But yeah, it's how you get all of these connections, but actually they're two distinctive peoples when they're coming across.
All right. Well, Aiden, man, we are well above the 1 hour mark. This was a really fun subject. And so I'm afraid that is going to be the end of this one, guys. But this was a very fun topic, really fun. And Aiden, I already got the topic for the show in 2 weeks. You're going to love this one. The Kingdom of Wales. The Welsh.
Yes, Wales. Yeah,
Wales.
The Kingdom of the Foreigners in Saxon.
Yeah, Wales, because
Wales means land of the foreigners.
Yeah, because Wales has always been interesting to me, even though I've never been to Wales. I don't even know, but Wales is always interesting because it never got under the umbrella of the English Empire, and we're going to talk about why.
Yes, that's why we're doing an episode on it, because that is situation. Yeah.
But we're gonna say that for a couple of weeks. But yeah, I know Aiden's gonna have a lot to say about Wales. So, but anyway, guys, Dungeon Dan, great show, guys. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Dungeon Dan, for watching. And that's gonna be it from us. For Saturnian Answers Maximus. That's been the Gate Aiden Kodia. I'm starting to feel a little better, so we're getting there. So, we're gonna say goodbye for now. Join us in 2 weeks when we talk about the Kingdom of Wales. It's going to be a very interesting one. So, yep. So until then, take care. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. Later, guys. Bye-bye.